Okay, let's dive in. We've got some fascinating sources here that really take us back to, well, a pretty crucial moment in American history.
Absolutely. We're talking tea, we're talking taxes, and a rather famous incident in Boston Harbor.
Right. And our goal today isn't just to recap what happened with the Boston Tea Party, but to really dig into why it was such a big deal based on these accounts.
Exactly. So let's set the scene. It's late autumn, 1773, in Boston. And the sources, they paint this picture of daily life, the harbor, the salt spray, but underneath,
Something simmering, a deep resentment, right?
definitely, an undercurrent of real tension.
And on the surface, it seems like it's all about tea.
Hmm.
But digging into these documents, it becomes clear pretty fast it's about way more. It's about principle.
That's the heart of it. And the spark, the immediate trigger, was Parliament's Tea Act.
Yes, the Tea Act. Now, this was kind of a clever move by Parliament, wasn't it? Or at least they thought so.
Well, it seemed clever. It actually lowered the price of tea sold by the British East India Company, which was struggling financially. A bit of a bailout for them.
Cheaper tea sounds good, but what was the catch?
The catch was huge. Crucially, the act kept the Townshend duty on tea. That small tax the colonists hated because it was imposed without their consent.
Taxation without representation. That phrase just echoes through this period.
Precisely. And from the colonial perspective, especially in Boston, which was, let's face it, a real hotbed of resistance, this wasn't seen as a bargain.
No, they saw it as something else entirely.
They saw it as another attack on their rights, a sort of blatant attempt to trick them, or maybe force them into accepting Parliament's right to tax them.
And groups like the Sons of Liberty, with figures like Samuel Adams really organizing things, they weren't buying it.
Not for a second. Our sources show they saw right through the lower price. They viewed it as a trap.
Because accepting the cheaper tea meant
Or what?
accepting the tax.
Exactly. It meant implicitly agreeing that Parliament could tax them. And their stance became very firm, very quickly. This tea was not going to be unloaded. It wouldn't land in Boston.
So the stage is set. Then the conflict literally sails into view. 3 ships, right?
The Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. All arriving in Boston Harbor, holds full of East India Company tea.
And that immediately creates a standoff.
A very tense one. The Sons of Liberty, and really a large part of the town, demanded the ships just turn around, go back to England, tea and all.
But the royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, he had other ideas.
Oh, completely. The sources describe him as a staunch loyalist. He absolutely refused to let the ships leave. He insisted the tea had to be unloaded, and crucially, the duty had to be paid.
And he backed that up.
He did. He ordered British warships to blockade the harbor entrance. The tea ships were physically trapped. They couldn't leave even if they wanted to.
Wow. So it's a stalemate, but there's a clock ticking.
There is a legal deadline. The law at the time said that if customs duties weren't paid within 20 days of a ship's arrival, the customs officials could seize the cargo.
And for the Dartmouth, that first ship, the deadline was
December 17th. If the duty wasn't paid by then, the officials would take the tea, unload it themselves, and sell it.
which would completely bypass the colonists' whole protest. The tax would be paid, the principal conceded.
Exactly. So the pressure was immense.
And it all comes to a head just before that deadline, December 16th, 1773. Describe that night for us, based on the accounts.
It was apparently a cold, damp night. Thousands of people, literally thousands, crammed into the Old South Meeting House. It was one of the biggest buildings in Boston, but still people were spilling out into the streets around it, waiting.
And Samuel Adams was there, addressing this huge crowd.
Yes, they sent one last appeal to Governor Hutchinson. Would he relent? Let the ships go?
And the answer came back.
A firm no. Hutchinson refused. And that's when Adams reportedly stood up and declared this meeting can do nothing more to save the country.
Which sounds like giving up, but it wasn't, was it?
Not at all. Everyone understood it. It was a signal. The time for talk was over.
What happened next?
Immediately, war whoops were heard. A large group of men, many disguised, loosely disguised, really as Mohawk Indians, surged out of the meeting house and headed straight for Griffin's Wharf where the tea ships were docked.
Let's talk about that disguise for a second. Why Mohawk Indians?
Well, the sources suggest it wasn't just about hiding identities, though that was part of it. It symbolized something more, a distinctly American identity, separate from Britain, maybe even evoking a sense of natural liberty, perceived as free from the constraints of British rule.
Interesting. And who are these men? behind the disguises.
That's what's really striking. They weren't just dock workers or unknown rabble-rousers. The accounts tell us they were respected members of the community. Merchants, craftsmen, doctors, farmers, laborers, people whose names we know now, many of them prominent citizens.
So their identities might have been masked, but their purpose was clear and, it seems, widely supported.
Very much so. They boarded the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver.
And then the main event. How did it actually unfold?
The accounts emphasize how organized and, well, disciplined they were. They worked for about 3 hours. Chest after heavy chest of tea, these things weighed hundreds of pounds, was hauled up from the holds.
And they didn't just toss them overboard.
No, they broke them open first.
Yeah.
Using axes, smashing the wooden chests. Then they dumped the tea leaves themselves into the harbor.
Just the tea.
Just the tea. The sheer volume is incredible when you think about it. 342 chests in total. Tons of valuable tea destroyed, floating in the cold water.
And it's crucial, isn't it, what they didn't do?
Absolutely critical, and the sources make a point of this. They were careful not to damage the ships themselves, beyond breaking the chests. No looting of other cargo. No harming the ship's crews. One participant even reportedly replaced a padlock he accidentally broke.
So it was a very targeted protest, focused entirely on the tea and the tax it represented, not random destruction.
Precisely. It was an act of defiance aimed squarely at the symbol of the tax policy they rejected. A matter of principle, enacted dramatically.
Okay, so the tea is in the harbor. What was the reaction back in Britain when news arrived?
Utter shock. And then fury. King George III, Lord North's government, Parliament, they didn't see this as some kind of principled stand.
How did they see it?
They saw it as vandalism, as destruction of private property, as an outright, blatant act of rebellion against the authority of the Crown and Parliament. There's very little sympathy for the colonists' arguments in London after this.
So the British response was going to be tough.
Swift and harsh. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of laws designed specifically to punish Massachusetts, and Boston in particular. The colonists immediately called them the Intolerable Acts.
Intolerable acts. What did they actually do?
They were punitive, aimed at crushing the colony's resistance. First, they closed the port of Boston, completely shut it down to all trade until the ruined tea was paid for, which was a massive economic blow.
Okay, hitting them in the wallet. What else?
They fundamentally altered the Massachusetts government. The Massachusetts Government Act took away many of the colonists' traditional rights, like electing members to the upper house of the legislature. Town meetings, which were vital centers of local debate and resistance, were severely restricted.
Undermining their self-governance.
Exactly. And another act made it easier for royal officials accused of crimes in the colonies to be tried in Britain or another colony away from potentially hostile local juries. Plus, an updated quartering act made it simpler for the British Army to house soldiers in private homes or other buildings.
Wow. That's quite a package. The intention was clear. Bring Massachusetts to heel. Did it work?
And here's the great irony, the critical turning point revealed in the sources. It did the absolute opposite.
How so?
Far from crushing the spirit of rebellion in Massachusetts and isolating them, the Intolerable Acts completely backfired. They galvanized the other 12 colonies.
Why? Why did the other colonies care so much about Boston being punished?
Because they saw what was happening to Massachusetts and thought, that could be us next. They saw the British government willing to shut down a major port, dismantle a colonial government, restrict basic rights.
They realized their own liberties were on the line.
Precisely. An attack on Massachusetts felt like an attack on the rights of all the colonies. If Parliament could do that to Boston, what stopped them from doing it to Philadelphia or Charleston or New York?
So, instead of dividing the colonies, it united them.
In a way nothing else had before. You see this surge of activity in the sources. The committees of correspondence, these networks the colonies used to share information and coordinate, went into overdrive. Support, both moral and material, flowed into Boston from other colonies.
And this led to something bigger.
It led directly to the First Continental Congress. By September 1774, just months after the Intolerable Acts were passed, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies Georgia held out initially gathered in Philadelphia.
To figure out a collective response.
Exactly, to discuss the Intolerable Acts, the relationship with Britain, and what to do next. It was an unprecedented show of colonial unity, sparked directly by the events following the Two-Party.
So when you trace it back, this whole dramatic sequence started with a protest over tea, a specific tax, a specific principle.
That act of defiance at Griffin's Wharf, dumping 342 chests of tea, it really did burr up a storm.
It set off a chain reaction,
Right.
the harsh British response, the intolerable acts,
Which in turn created this unexpected, powerful colonial unity.
leading straight to the Continental Congress and ultimately down the road to revolution and independence. It's quite a trajectory.
It really is. It shows how a focused act, driven by a core principle like no taxation without representation, could escalate so dramatically and really change the course of history for an entire continent.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, maybe something for you, the listener, to think about. How can an event centered on essentially a consumer good and a tax dispute escalate through reaction and counter-reaction to ignite such widespread unity and set a path towards forming a new nation? It really makes you consider the power symbols and principles hold in shaping historical events, doesn't it?